Welcome back to The Good, the Bad, and the Game Boy, the ongoing series in which I attempt to play and review every game in the North American Game Boy library, 3 games at a time. In this episode, we'll be looking at 3 games that were sequels, spin-offs, or otherwise related to games that were more commonly associated with the NES. Obviously, I'm not going to get to every single game in this video, so if there's another game you'd like to see covered, feel free to mention it in the comment section below. But in the meantime, steal some AA batteries out of your TV remote control, pull up a spot under the brightest lamp in the house, and let's revisit some more of our favorite NES franchises as they appeared on the Game Boy. When accounting for some of the very best games on the Nintendo Entertainment System, no list would be complete without at least a mention of Contra, which is, without hyperbole, one of the most perfect action games ever made. With impeccable controls, very good graphics for its time, brilliant pacing, just the perfect amount of challenge without being totally unfair, and an absolutely amazing soundtrack. It's no wonder that most people would say that the NES version of Contra is better than the technically superior arcade version that it was based on. And honestly, even the people who say they prefer the arcade game are probably only saying that to be different. I don't think they mean it. Contra the arcade game got a sequel called Super Contra, which was ported to the NES in 1990 as Super C. It's a given that Super C was better than its arcade counterpart, unless of course you're one of the people who just like to be different. But I'd go even further by saying that Super C was an improvement over the NES original, with even better graphics, a soundtrack that is at least as good as the music from the original game, and a slightly higher level of challenge offset by some quality of life adjustments that make some people consider Super C the easier game of the two. Super C also introduced the top-down levels, which replaced the pseudo 3D base levels from the first game. The question of which is the overall better game of the two is fiercely debated to this day, with many people defaulting to Contra for no other reason than this was the one they played the most growing up and therefore have the most nostalgia for. And by the way, Contra Force has no place in this discussion. We don't talk about that one. Because of its popularity, the Contra series was among the first NES series to receive a Game Boy entry, as Operation C. Operation C is not a port of either Contra or Super C, although it draws very heavily from both games. Most of its soundtrack is pulled from Contra, although there are a small number of original tracks mixed in as well. Although none of the game's 5 stages are direct recreation of any level from the NES games, it's pretty clear that they were all inspired by levels that appeared in those previous games. The opening stage is very reminiscent of the first stage in Super C, and at the game's halfway point there's a level that starts out as a direct nod to the jungle stage in Super C, before morphing into the waterfall stage from Contra. The second and fourth areas use the top-down perspective, as well as the overall aesthetics, from the 2 overhead levels from Super C. In the final area, despite some original elements like alien creatures that burst out of their holding tanks, appears to be based on the 4th stage in Super C, complete with an elevator section and a gauntlet of those bubble-spewing cannons. Strangely, the game seems to end with an homage to Gradius. The final boss, if you want to call it that, is a defenseless creature that helplessly pulsates as you destroy its holding tank, much like the brain entity that you face at the end of Gradius. Despite the fact that Operation C borrows a lot of ideas from its NES counterparts, it brings a few innovations as well. Your default weapon is the auto-firing machine gun, which is a definite improvement over the button-mashing pea shooter that you start with in the other games. The iconic spread shot returns, but this time it can be powered up by collecting 2 S icons in a row. There's also the flame weapon from Super C, which is definitely the strongest weapon in the game, even though you can't charge it up like you can with the NES version. Now, arguably the best weapon in the game is the homing shot, which fires multiple bullets at a time that automatically home in on any enemies on the screen. The homing gun would go on to appear in the glorified Super Nintendo tech demo they called Contra 3, but it showed up here first on the Game Boy. Graphically, this is a typical Game Boy game from Konami, which is to say that it looks great. As they did with the portable Castlevania games, Konami redrew the character sprites to fit nicely into the Game Boy's screen, while still approximating the character-to-screen proportions that you find in the console games. The stages are heavily detailed without being overwhelming, and there's some cool background animations, like the suddenly drifting water in the opening harbor area and the waving palm trees in the jungle stage. As for how the game plays, Konami adapted Contra's action-heavy, bullet-flying gameplay as well as they could have. Remember that Operation C was originally intended to be played on a tiny unlit dot matrix screen with a very low refresh rate. The motion blur alone would have rendered this game virtually unplayable if it carried over the intensity from the NES games. As a result, the enemies in Operation C are far less aggressive. There are fewer enemies that shoot projectiles at you, and the whole game runs noticeably slower. This of course means that Operation C is definitely on the easier side, which might feel a bit off-brand for a game bearing the Contra name. But it still offers up a fairly decent challenge, so it's unlikely to be a game you'll be able to finish on your very first attempt. Maybe your second though. By my estimation, the first Game Boy game developed outside of Japan was from British developer and longtime Nintendo collaborator Rare. And there's some nice uniformity to this, as Rare also had the distinction of creating the first non-Japanese game for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Rare's ongoing partnership with Nintendo would result in some of the most iconic games of the 90s, from Battletoads on the NES and the Donkey Kong trilogy on the Super Nintendo, to Killer Instinct in the arcades, and of course, pretty much every single popular game on the N64 that wasn't made by Nintendo themselves. But Rare's first hit was arguably Wizards and Warriors on the NES, a charmingly janky and occasionally frustrating game that still managed to be fun and addictive thanks to its bouncy and engaging gameplay mechanics and its catchy music. Wizards and Warriors was followed up in 1989 by Iron Sword, which improved on the original game in almost every way and not just by featuring a bare-chested Fabio on the box art. Wizards and Warriors X, Fortress of Fear, is the third game in the series. Although the confusing numeration of the title and the fact that the manual states that this game takes place 17 years after the events of the first game makes it a little unclear as to exactly where this game fits in the Wizards and Warriors timeline. You can either read the title of the game literally as Wizards and Warriors X or as Wizards and Warriors 10, which would imply that Rare had so much faith in the Wizards and Warriors series that they released the 10th game immediately after the second game, assuming that they'd eventually come out with the remaining 7 games to fill out the series at some point in the future. However, I've always assumed that the X was supposed to mean that this game wasn't part of the trilogy of games that appeared on the NES, but instead more of a side story, a Wizards and Warriors Gaiden, if you will. I guess this is all kind of a moot point though, because Fortress of Fear pretty much marks the end of the Wizards and Warriors series. No one ever talks about the third game that appeared on the NES, and it's hard to find anyone who has anything positive to say about Fortress of Fear, because it's not a very good game. Fortress of Fear is a bit of a departure from the 2 NES games that preceded it. While the gameplay of the NES games was more exploration-based, with the main character Kyros needing to collect various items and power-ups to complete each area, Fortress of Fear is extremely basic, simply requiring you to move from left to right, and occasionally right to left, to reach the end of each stage. Along the way, you'll have the opportunity to collect a small number of power-ups, like a shield that increases your defense, or the Boots of Jumping, which will, as the name suggests, increase your jumping ability. These items appear in chests scattered around the stages, which you'll need to find keys to open. While the power-ups in the NES games more or less provided permanent upgrades, the power-ups in Fortress of Fear only last as long as you could stay alive. Taking a death will reset all the items and lock chests in the stage, meaning that if you want either one of those items again, you'll have to first find a key and then whichever chest holds whatever item you want. Of course, that's assuming you have any lives remaining in the first place. Death comes so easily in Fortress of Fear that you can expect to become quite familiar with the game over screen. And since there are no continues or passwords, seeing this screen means you'll be restarting the game from the very beginning. You'll be constantly taking deaths by missing jumps due to the weird jumping physics. This game takes a page from Castlevania Adventure by often requiring you to be almost completely standing off the edge of a platform in order to successfully make a jump. And the platforms often use a quasi-3D perspective, which makes it very difficult to gauge how close you're standing to the edge. The size of the character sprite doesn't do you any favors either. Although this is a very good reproduction of the sprite from the NES game, it's also a very good example of why NES accurate sprites don't work especially well on the Game Boy screen. There's very little room between Kyros and the edge of the screen, so you are constantly being hit by fast-moving enemies and projectiles. The annoying solution to this problem is to always be slowly tiptoeing forward to keep from being surprised by all the bats, arrows, fireballs, skulls, minotaurs, and axes the game throws at you. And also, when you take a hit, there's no invincibility frames to speak of, so a single enemy can completely drain your life bar if you don't move out of the way quickly enough. But the most frustrating aspect of the game is the fall damage. Falling from too great a height will take away half a heart and will also stun Kyros for a moment, leaving you open to taking another hit or two from an enemy while you're just sitting there immobilized. Worst of all, the fall damage is inconsistent. Sometimes you could jump from the very top of the screen without an issue, but other times you'll take damage if you drop from a height barely taller than your character sprite. Seeing as how Fortress of Fear is a rare game, it should come as no surprise that the soundtrack was composed by David Wise. Now, Wise is consistently the best part of whatever game he's involved with. Unfortunately, the music in Fortress of Fear is definitely among the lower tier of David Wise's soundtracks. There's a handful of genuinely great tunes, like the title theme and the dungeon theme from Stage 2. But the rest of the soundtrack ranges from completely forgettable to actively irritating. However, even when David Wise is at his worst, he's still a standout in Rare's games, which is either a testament to what a great composer he is, or a referendum on how subpar many of Rare's games actually are. Fortress of Fear isn't an exceptionally difficult game, but it is extremely frustrating, which, as it happens, is also how I describe the two NES games that preceded this one. But the NES games, despite having a laundry list of issues of their own, still provided enough interesting and engaging gameplay that it offset the clumsy controls and often unfair game mechanics. But there's not much about Fortress of Fear that is particularly fun or engaging. There's a handful of hidden rooms to find, but since there are very few items in the game that are particularly valuable, going off the beaten path for an extra life or a health refill feels more like a requirement for finishing the game instead of a reward for discovering a secret area. Although I wouldn't say that Fortress of Fear is the worst Game Boy game I've ever played, I can still say with some certainty that it is one of the worst, and it's a pretty solid reminder that Rare was an extremely hit-or-miss developer. For every Donkey Kong Country or Banjo-Kazooie, there were one or two games like this one, that truly make you question how in the hell Rare ever became as well loved as they are today. The original Double Dragon released in the arcades in 1987, and is widely considered one of the earliest examples of a beat-em-up game. Double Dragon was ported to the NES in 1988, and then later adapted to the Game Boy in 1990. Although the Game Boy version of Double Dragon differed from the NES version in a few ways, it's still similar enough that you can pretty easily identify it as essentially the same game. The arcade and NES versions of Double Dragon would each receive a sequel, both called Double Dragon 2: The Revenge. But despite sharing the same name and promotional artwork, the two games had very little in common. In 1991, the Game Boy would get its own Double Dragon 2, which wasn't based on either the NES or arcade versions of the game. The story of the game is that, presumably following the events of the first Double Dragon, Billy Lee joined a martial arts gang called the Scorpions. One day, the leader of the Scorpions is murdered, and through some very circumstantial evidence, everyone gets the idea that Billy Lee is the one who did the murdering. And so this game follows Billy as he heads across town to the Scorpions' headquarters to tell the newly appointed gang leader that he didn't do it. Along the way, you'll have to punch and kick your way through waves of thugs and gang members. Although some of the enemies are armed with baseball bats, knives, bicycle chains, and even handguns, you can't disarm them and use their weapons as your own as you could in the other Double Dragon games. The combat here is quick, fun, and satisfying, even though Billy doesn't have quite the variety of moves that he had in the other games. In addition to the basic punch and kick, you can grab enemies and wail on their faces. If you approach an enemy who has been knocked down, you can do a chest-crushing aerial pile driver. And lastly, if you press A and B together, you'll crouch down. And if you quickly press either button again, you'll unleash a leaping uppercut straight out of Street Fighter 2. It's a little tricky to pull off, but this is the most powerful move in the game. combining this move with the pile driver finisher is the fastest and most effective way to deal with every enemy in the game. Somewhere in each of the game's 3 stages, you'll face the area's boss. And these are some great character designs. There's a lanky boxer who looks like Glass Joe from Punch-Out!, and a ninja who warps around the screen and attacks you with his spirit form like Ryu from Ninja Gaiden. My favorite is the hulking chainsaw-wielding maniac in a hockey mask. These guys aren't terribly difficult since they can all be easily taken down by spamming the uppercut pile driver combo, but they might give you a little trouble towards the end of the game, where you have to refight all of them one after the other. And best of all, if you have a friend with their own copy of the game, you can link your systems together and play through the game cooperatively, which is a tragically underused and seldom seen feature on the Game Boy. Even though there aren't many true beat-em-ups on the Game Boy, Double Dragon 2 is still easily the best one. It's so good in fact that you might not even notice that it doesn't even really feel like a proper Double Dragon game. And there's a good reason for this. Double Dragon 2 technically isn't a Double Dragon game at all. But to explain that, we're going to need to take a look back on how the Double Dragon series originated in the first place. Double Dragon was originally created by Yoshihisa Kishimoto, and was kind of a spiritual sequel to a game he made in 1986 called Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun, which roughly translates to Hot-Blooded Tough Guy Kunio-kun, which was released outside of Japan as Renegade. The Kunio-kun and Double Dragon series were both published by Technos, although Kunio-kun and this distinctive blocky character design are typically what people picture when they think of a Technos game. The Kunio-kun series would prove to be far more prolific than the Double Dragon series, and its games also would not be locked to a single genre. Many of its games were more arcadey sports games. Nintendo World Cup, Super Dodgeball, and Crash and the Boys Street Challenge were all US localizations of games from the Kunio-kun series, many of which also appeared on the Game Boy. Also worth mentioning is that when Ocean got the rights to produce their own version of Renegade for various home computers, they continued making their own sequels independent of the Kunio-kun and Double Dragon series, one of which we actually received here in the US, Target Renegade. So just on the NES alone, there were effectively 3 separate series that all branched off from this one game. Outside of Renegade, the only other beat-em-up style Kunio-kun game that came to the NES was River City Ransom, which wasn't so much a traditional beat-em-up as it was an action RPG, with a sprawling open world, by NES standards at least, and a robust character development system in which characters could receive permanent status effects by reading books and eating various food items throughout the game. Double Dragon 2 is the localization of a Game Boy entry to the Kunio-kun series. If you're a fan of River City Ransom, and presumably any other game in the River City series, Double Dragon 2 feels and sounds like it belongs more to that series than the Double Dragon series. Playing the 2 games back to back, it's hard not to be impressed by the amount of work they put into localizing the game for Western audiences. As you can see here, the story is totally different between the 2 versions of the game. And they didn't stop at just replacing the character sprites. The backgrounds in many of the areas have been completely redesigned. They also composed an entirely new soundtrack, and it's great music. I'd say better than the original game's music, but still done in a style that sounds more appropriate for River City Ransom than a Double Dragon game. It's hard to say which version of the game I prefer, since from a pure gameplay perspective, the 2 games are identical. But I prefer the Kunio-kun characters over the Double Dragon sprites. And Kunio's little spin as he pulls off an uppercut is definitely cooler to look at than Billy Lee's static punch. The music and boss characters are better in Double Dragon 2 though, so I suppose the best compromise is just to play them both. Regardless of which version of the game you play, this is still easily one of the best action games on the Game Boy, especially if you're looking for a good beat 'em up. If you made it this far, allow me to formally welcome you to the end of the video. If you liked this video and want to see more, there are many more Game Boy focused videos on my channel, just like this one. If you have a favorite Game Boy game or game series, feel free to mention it in the comment section below. And I'll see you next time on The Good, The Bad, and the Game Boy.